In the mountains of the Appalachians, where silence is broken only by the wind through the pine trees, there exists a mystery that defies all logic. In November of 1957, an experienced man who knew those mountains like the back of his hand simply vanished into thin air. For 5 long years, not a single trace of him was found. No clue, no answer. Until October of 1962, when 2 young boys stumbled upon something that would make the mystery even deeper and more disturbing. What happened on that cold November morning? Why did a veteran hunter, armed and prepared, never return home? And what was his rifle doing perfectly preserved beneath an oak tree, miles distant from where he was last seen? This is the story of Thomas Brennan, and what happened to him in the depths of the Appalachians continues to be one of the most baffling disappearance cases in American history. If you are fascinated by unsolved mysteries and cases that defy explanation, this channel is for you. Do not forget to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you do not miss a single case. And stay until the end, because the details of the discovery of that rifle will make your blood run cold. I promise that every second of this video will reveal something that will make this mystery even more impossible to explain. Thomas Michael Brennan was 42 years old that autumn of 1957. For those who knew him in the small town of Elk Ridge, West Virginia, Tom was not just another resident. He was the type of man who defined that mountain community. Tall, standing at approximately 6 feet 1 inch, with broad shoulders built by decades of manual labor, Tom had that kind of presence that filled a room the moment he entered. His eyes were of a deep blue, almost gray, which his wife Dorothy used to say changed color depending on the light. He had dark brown hair that was beginning to gray at the temples, always cut short and combed back. A face, marked by the sun and outdoor work, with wrinkles around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. And Tom smiled frequently. He was known for his dry sense of humor and for his deep laugh that echoed through Miller's General Store, where the men of the town gathered on Saturdays. Tom worked as a supervisor at the local sawmill, the Appalachian Timber Company, a position he had held for 17 years. He was respected by the men who worked under his supervision. Fair, but firm. He never asked anyone to do something he himself would not do. He started his day at 5:30 in the morning, always the first to arrive at the sawmill, and was frequently the last to leave. But it was in the mountains that Tom truly felt at home. He had grown up hunting those slopes with his father, who had grown up hunting with his own father. It was a tradition that ran in the blood of the Brennan family for generations. Tom knew every trail, every ravine, every water spring in those mountains. He could read the forest like other men read newspapers. He knew how to tell when a storm was coming by the way the birds behaved. He knew the movement patterns of deer in every season. He could look at a track and tell exactly when the animal had passed through. Dorothy Brennan, his wife of 19 years, used to say that Tom had 2 loves in his life, his family and those mountains. They had met at a church dance when Dorothy was only 16 years old, and Tom was 19. She fell in love with his kindness, with the way he treated his mother, with the patience he demonstrated with everything. Together, they had 3 children. Michael, the oldest, was 17 years old in 1957 and was already working at the sawmill alongside his father. Sarah was 14 years old, a quiet teenager who loved to read and dreamed of becoming a teacher. And then there was little Bobby, only 8 years old, who followed his father everywhere like a shadow, already begging to go hunting with him. The family lived in a simple but cozy house on Oak Street. 2 blocks from the Methodist church they attended every Sunday. Dorothy kept the house impeccably clean, with white curtains in the windows and flowers in the front yard during spring and summer. The aroma of fresh coffee and apple pie seemed permanently embedded in those walls. Tom was a man of routines. He woke up at 5 in the morning every day, even on Sundays. He drank his coffee black and strong, prepared by Dorothy, while reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. He always wore the same brown work boots, so worn that Dorothy insisted on buying new ones. But he refused, saying those boots already knew his feet. On Saturdays, after work, he always stopped at Miller's to buy a chocolate bar for each child. On Friday nights, he always took Dorothy to dinner at the only restaurant in town, the Blue Ridge Diner. But it was during hunting season that Tom truly transformed. His eyes shone in a different way. There was an energy in him, an anticipation. He spent weeks preparing his equipment, meticulously cleaning his Winchester Model 70 rifle, checking his backpack, studying topographic maps by lamplight at the kitchen table. Tom's rifle was his most precious possession, a Winchester Model 70 caliber .30-06 with walnut stock and telescopic sight. He had purchased that rifle in 1946, shortly after returning from World War II, where he served as a corporal in the European theater. The rifle cost him 3 months' salary, but Tom said it was worth every penny. He kept it in a locked glass case in the living room, polished and shining. The initials TMB were engraved on the metal plate on the stock. In the community of Elk Ridge, Tom was more than respected. He was admired. Always the first to volunteer when someone needed help. When Widow Henderson's house caught fire in the winter of 1955, it was Tom who organized the men of the town to rebuild it. When the Petersons' 12-year-old son got lost in the mountains for 3 terrifying hours in 1956, it was Tom who found him, following tracks that no one else could see. Pastor William Hadley of the Elk Ridge Methodist Church would later describe Tom as the type of man Christ would have called friend, honest in his words, generous in his actions, and humble in his spirit. But there was something more about Tom Brennan that made his disappearance so incomprehensible. He was cautious, meticulous, the type of man who checked everything 3 times. He never hunted alone without telling Dorothy exactly where he would be, which trails he would follow, what time he expected to return. He always carried a compass, waterproof matches, a pocket knife, and extra ropes. He always wore his bright orange vest during hunting season. He always left marks on trees to find his way back. This was Thomas Brennan, dedicated father, loving husband, reliable worker, experienced hunter, a man who knew those mountains with an intimacy that took generations to develop, a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And that made what was about to happen completely inexplicable. The dawn of November 16th, 1957 arrived cold and clear over Elk Ridge. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit during the night, and a thin layer of frost covered every surface. The sky was a deep blue and cloudless, promising a perfect day for hunting. Tom Brennan woke up at 4:45 in the morning, 15 minutes earlier than usual. Dorothy woke to the sound of him moving around the room in the dark, gathering his clothes. She remembers having turned on the bedside lamp and looked at the clock. "It is too early, Tom," she murmured, still half asleep. Tom smiled at her in that golden twilight. "The best time to catch a deer is when it is moving from the feeding location back to its bed. I need to be in position before sunrise." He dressed in layers, as he always did in the cold November weather. Thermal underwear underneath, then a red and black checkered flannel shirt. a gray wool sweater, and on top his dark brown hunting jacket, thick hunting pants, hiking boots that he had waterproofed the night before, leather gloves, and his characteristic orange hunting hat with flaps to protect his ears from the cold. Dorothy prepared coffee while Tom checked his equipment for the third time. He packed his backpack methodically on the kitchen table. 2 Hershey chocolate bars, a thermos of hot coffee, 4 ham and cheese sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, an apple, his military compass from the war, an extra set of ammunition, a roll of rope, waterproof matches in a metal tin, his pocket knife, a small first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries. It was 5:20 in the morning when Tom picked up his Winchester from the glass case. He checked the chamber, checked the safety, ran his hand over the U&D polished wood stock as he always did. Dorothy watched him from the kitchen doorway, holding her own cup of coffee. "Where will you be today?" she asked. It was the question she always asked, the question Tom always answered with military precision. "I am going up through the Black Creek Trail," Tom responded, spreading a topographic map on the table. He traced the route with his finger. "I will follow for about 3 miles until I reach the ridge above Wolf Valley. There is a plateau there," he pointed to an area on the map, "where I saw deer tracks last week. Large ones, probably an 8-point buck. I will find a position there and wait. If I do not have luck by noon, I will descend down the west slope and return via the Cedar Ridge Trail." Dorothy nodded. She had heard similar descriptions hundreds of times before. "What time will you be home?" "Dark falls at 5:15, Tom said, folding the map. "I will be back at 5:30. At the latest by 6 if I get a deer and need to clean it." It was exactly 5:45 in the morning when Tom kissed Dorothy at the front door. The type of kiss he always gave, nothing special, just a common goodbye kiss. "I love you," he said. "I love you too," she responded. "Be careful." Tom put the backpack on his back, picked up his rifle, and walked toward his blue 1954 Ford pickup truck parked in the driveway. Dorothy stood at the door watching as he placed the rifle in the rack behind the seat, started the engine, and drove down Oak Street toward the mountain road. The last time she saw him, it was 5:48 in the morning. The taillights of his pickup disappeared around the curve, and he was gone. What Dorothy did not know at that moment was that she would never see her husband again. Tom arrived at the beginning of the Black Creek Trail at 6:17 in the morning. We know this because he stopped at the forest ranger station, as was required during hunting season, and signed the register. For the forest ranger on duty was a young man of 23 years old named David Kowalski. He would later give a detailed statement about that interaction. Tom arrived shortly after 6, David would recall. He was in good spirits, smiling, making jokes about how he was finally going to catch that big deer he had been tracking. He signed the register at 6:17. I remember the exact time because I had just looked at the clock, wondering how much time was left until my shift ended. He told me exactly where he was going, the Black Creek Trail to the ridge of Wolf Valley. He said he would be back before nightfall. Nothing about him seemed worried or strange. It was just Tom, doing what he did best. The Black Creek Trail was one of the most popular in the area, but on that November Saturday, Tom was alone. The temperature was still below freezing, and most hunters would wait until later in the morning. But Tom wanted to be in position before sunrise. The trail climbed steadily, following a frozen stream that gave the path its name. It was frozen that morning, the water barely moving under a thin layer of ice. The trees were mainly oaks and hickories at that level, their leaves long fallen, creating a crunchy carpet under Tom's feet. Higher up, pine trees dominated, their dark green needles creating a dramatic contrast against the increasingly clear sky. Tom knew every meter of that trail. He had hunted there dozens of times. He moved with the confidence of a man on familiar terrain, his rifle comfortably in hand, his breath creating small clouds of vapor in the frozen air. The sun rose at 7:12 in the morning that day. We know Tom was still moving toward his destination at that moment, because at 7:23 he encountered another hunter descending the trail. That man's name was Robert Bobby Chen, a 35-year-old hunter who lived in the neighboring town of Pinewood. Bobby Chen would provide the last confirmed account of anyone who saw Thomas Brennan alive. "I was descending because I was not having any luck," Bobby would report later to police. "The sun was rising, and I decided to return early, maybe try again in the afternoon. That is when I saw Tom climbing up. I recognized him immediately. Everybody around knew Tom Brennan. We stopped and talked for maybe 5 minutes. He asked me if I had seen any tracks. I said no, that things were quiet. He laughed and said that was good. It meant the deer were still up there, waiting for him. I asked where he was going, and he said he was heading to the plateau above Wolf Valley. I warned him that there was a storm coming. I could feel it in the air, but he looked at the sky and said it was clear, that everything would be fine. He seemed normal, happy, excited. Nothing was wrong. We said goodbye, and he continued climbing. I continued descending. I looked back once, maybe 30 seconds later, and saw him through the trees, still climbing, moving fast and steady. And then he disappeared behind a curve in the trail, and that was the last time anyone saw him. Bobby Chen looked at his watch during that conversation. It was exactly 7:23 in the morning. This detail, that precise moment in time, would become crucial because it established that Tom was alive and well, approximately 2.5 miles from the beginning of the trail, with still about 1.25 miles to go to his destination. The plateau Tom was seeking was at an altitude of approximately 4,000 feet. It was a flat, open space of perhaps 150 feet in diameter, surrounded by dense pine trees, with a clear view of the valley below. A perfect location for a hunter to wait, observing the movement patterns of deer. Tom had hunted there before. He would know exactly where to position himself. If he maintained his normal pace, Tom would have reached the plateau around 8:15 in the morning. He would have found his position, perhaps behind a fallen log or among the rocks, and settled in to wait. And then nothing. Silence. As if he had simply ceased to exist. Back in Elk Ridge, Dorothy spent the day doing her usual Saturday chores. She cleaned the house. She prepared lunch for the children. She shopped at Miller's General Store. She began preparing dinner around 4 in the afternoon, hoping Tom would arrive home with good stories, perhaps even with a deer. 5:30 in the afternoon arrived. The sun had set. No Tom. Dorothy was not worried yet. He had said it could be until 6 if he got a deer. 6 o'clock arrived. Then 6:15. 6:30. Now Dorothy was at the front window, looking through the white curtain at the dark street, hoping to see the headlights of Tom's blue pickup. Her stomach began to tighten with that first spark of worry. At 7 o'clock, Dorothy called the Forest Ranger Station. David Kowalski was still on duty. Yes, he confirmed, Tom had signed in that morning. No, he had not signed out. But that was not unusual, David assured her. Many hunters forgot to sign out, especially when they were anxious to get home. At 7:30, Dorothy called Tom's best friend, James Parker, who also hunted frequently in those mountains. James immediately said he would go to the beginning of the trail to look. 15 minutes later, he called back. Tom's pickup was still parked in the trail access area, alone in the gravel parking lot, covered with frost. It was at that moment that Dorothy's worry transformed into true fear. Tom never, ever stayed in the mountains after dark, not without an extremely good reason, and he certainly would have returned to his pickup. At 8:15 in the evening of November 16, 1957, Dorothy Brennan called the Randolph County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Harold Mitchell, a 58-year-old man who had known Tom since he was a boy, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Tom Brennan was not the type of man who caused false alarm. If he had not returned, something was seriously wrong. But there was a problem. It was night. Searching in the dark, frozen mountains was not just dangerous, it was almost impossible. The decision was made to wait until dawn, but to have teams ready to move at the first sign of light. Dorothy did not sleep that night. She sat in the living room, staring at the empty glass case where Tom's rifle normally rested, while the hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. Michael stayed awake, with her, his hand holding hers, neither of them saying much. What was there to say? All they could do was wait and pray. But in the depths of the Appalachian Mountains, where silence was broken only by the wind through the pine trees, something had happened to Thomas Brennan. Something that would defy all explanation. Something that would begin a mystery that would haunt that community for the next 5 years, and then become even more inexplicable when that rifle was finally found. The dawn of November 17, 1957, arrived gray and threatening. During the night, the weather had changed dramatically. Low, heavy clouds hung over the mountains, and a cold mist rose from the valley. The temperature had risen only a few degrees above freezing. Bobby Chen had been right. There was a storm coming. At 6 in the morning, more than 60 volunteers gathered at the beginning of the Black Creek Trail. Men from Elk Ridge and neighboring towns. Many of them had been led by Tom in previous searches when other people got lost. Now it was Tom who needed to be found, and the irony was not lost on anyone. Sheriff Mitchell organized the men into teams of 4, each with a portable radio, maps, and first aid equipment. James Parker, who knew Tom's favorite hunting routes almost as well as Tom himself, led the main team that would go directly to the Wolf Valley Plateau. He said he was going to the plateau, James instructed the teams. That is our first priority, but we need to check every side trail, every ravine, every area where he could have left the path. The search began at 6:22 in the morning. The men moved in lines, scanning both sides of the trail, calling Tom's name, the sound of their voices echoing through the bare trees. The mist made visibility poor, no more than 100 feet in any direction. James's team reached the point where Bobby Chen had encountered Tom at 7:23 the previous morning. They marked the location and continued. If Tom had continued from here, as Bobby had said he was doing, then he should have followed the trail to the plateau. There was no reason for him to leave the path, but as they continued, something strange began to become apparent. Or rather, the absence of something. There were no tracks. The frost from the previous morning should have preserved footprints on the trail, especially in the muddy areas near the stream. Bobby Chen had left clear footprints. Other hunters who had been in the area had left footprints, but there was no trace of Tom's boots beyond the point where Bobby had seen him. It was as if he had simply left the trail and disappeared. At 9:45 in the morning, James's team reached the Wolf Valley Plateau. They searched the entire area meticulously. No sign of Tom, no footprints, No trace that he had ever been there. Nothing. "It is impossible," James would say later that night, his voice full of confusion and frustration. Tom knew these mountains better than anyone. If he was coming to this plateau, he would have gotten here. There is no way he could have gotten lost. And even if something had happened, a heart attack, a fall, anything, there would be signs. There would be something. But there is nothing. It is as if he was never here. Meanwhile, other teams scoured every side trail, every ravine, every area within a 5-mile radius of Tom's last known sighting. They searched in caves. They checked cliffs where he could have fallen. They inspected every stream where he could have slipped on ice. Nothing. On the second day of searches, the storm that Bobby Chen had felt coming finally arrived. Snow began to fall at 2 in the afternoon, light at first, but becoming heavier as the hours passed. This was disastrous. The snow would cover any remaining trace, any clue that might be there. Sheriff Mitchell made the difficult decision to bring in tracking dogs. 2 bloodhounds were brought from Charleston. They were given one of Tom's work shirts, still with his scent, and released on the trail where Bobby Chen had seen him for the last time. The dogs immediately picked up a trail. They pulled their handlers along the trail, noses to the ground, following the path Tom should have taken toward the plateau. But then, about half a mile beyond the last sighting point, the dogs stopped. They simply stopped. They walked in circles, confused, sniffing the air and the ground, but unable to find the trail again. It was as if Tom had stopped existing at exactly that point. In my 23 years training search dogs, the handler, a man named Vernon Hughes, would say, "I have never seen anything like this. The dogs were following a strong trail, and then nothing, simply nothing. As if the person had ascended into the air." The search continued for 9 days. More than 200 people eventually joined the effort. An Army helicopter was brought in and flew search patterns over the area. But the dense tree cover and increasingly heavy snow made aerial observations almost useless. Dorothy Brennan visited the search site every day, staying at the base area that had been established in the trail parking lot, serving coffee and sandwiches to volunteers, her eyes red from sleepless nights, her face pale and tense. Michael stayed beside her, having assumed the role of man of the house with a sudden and painful maturity. Pastor Hadley organized prayer vigils at the church. The entire town of Elk Ridge seemed to be in a state of shock. Tom Brennan was not just a member of the community, he was a pillar of it. If something could happen to Tom in those mountains, it could happen to anyone. On November 25, 1957, 9 days after Tom's disappearance, the active search was officially suspended. Almost 8 inches of snow had fallen. Temperatures had plummeted to 10 degrees Fahrenheit at night. Sheriff Mitchell made the announcement to the gathered volunteers, his voice heavy with defeat. "We have done everything humanly possible," he said. "We have searched every square meter within a 9-mile radius. There is no place we have not looked. There is no stone we have not turned. And we have found no trace of Tom Brennan." The investigation, however, did not stop. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. Sheriff Mitchell and his team began asking the difficult questions. Questions that no one wanted to ask, but that had to be asked. Could Tom have planned to disappear? Did he have financial problems, marital problems, a secret life? The answer to all these questions was a categorical no. Tom's finances were solid. He did not owe money to anyone. His relationship with Dorothy was, by all accounts, loving and stable. There was no other woman. There was no gambling addiction. No conceivable reason for him to run away. Tom loved his family more than anything, Dorothy would say, her voice breaking. He was excited about Christmas. We had planned to buy a new bicycle for Bobby. Tom was planning to teach Michael to drive the pickup in the spring. He had plans. He had a life. He would not just leave. So, could it have been violence? Could Tom have encountered someone in those mountains? Someone who wanted to hurt him? This theory also did not hold up. Tom was armed with a powerful rifle. He was a war veteran, trained in combat. He would not be easily overpowered. And even if someone had attacked him, they would have had to carry his body, somehow, into the depths of the mountains, without leaving any trail, without bloodshed, without sign of struggle. It was practically impossible. Could it have been an animal? A bear, perhaps? Bears were rare in that part of the Appalachians in November. Most were hibernating or nearly hibernating. But even if a bear had attacked Tom, there would be signs. Blood, torn clothing, his rifle. There would be something. And again, Tom was armed. He would know how to ward off a bear. Mountain lion? Practically extinct in the region in 1957. Wolves? Also practically extinct. No predator in the area could make an armed adult man simply disappear without leaving any trace. Could he have fallen into a hole or cave? All known cave formations in the area were checked. Spelunking teams descended into every opening they could find. Nothing. Could he have had a heart attack or stroke and dragged himself somewhere before dying? Possible, but unlikely. Tom was in excellent health. His sawmill physique kept him in top shape. And where would he have gone? Why would he have left the trail? And again, where was his rifle, his possessions, any sign of him? Every theory, when examined, fell apart. The disappearance of Thomas Brennan made no sense according to any logical scenario. It was in this vacuum of explanations that more bizarre theories began to circulate. Pete Morrison, an older hunter who claimed to know old stories about those mountains, began talking about the silent places. He said there were specific points in the Appalachians where people disappeared, where compasses spun wildly, where sound simply died. Natural anomalies, he called them. "These mountains are ancient," he would say to anyone who would listen. "Older than anyone understands. There are things here that do not follow normal rules." Others spoke about the historical accounts of disappearances in the region. And there were many. Native Americans who lived in these mountains for thousands of years before settlers arrived had legends about areas that should be avoided, places where spirits took people. In the 1880s, a group of 3 loggers disappeared under similar circumstances just 1 mile from that same plateau. Their bodies were never found. In 1923, a young woman named Rebecca Winters went out to gather firewood and simply vanished. In 1941, 2 boys playing on the lower slopes disappeared for 5 hours, then reappeared, unable to explain where they had been, claiming that only a few minutes had passed. Each of these cases could have rational explanations, but together they formed a pattern that made some people wonder if there was something in those mountains that science could not explain. The FBI was eventually called in January of 1958, 2 months after Tom's disappearance. Federal agents came because there was the possibility, however small, that Tom had crossed state lines, or that federal crime was involved. They conducted their own investigation, interviewed all witnesses again, examined all evidence. Their report, when it was finally issued in March of 1958, essentially said, "There is no evidence of federal crime. There is no evidence of violence. There is no evidence of voluntary flight. There is no logical explanation for what happened to Thomas Michael Brennan. The case would be left in the hands of local authorities." The case remained officially open, but practically, there was nothing more to do except wait. Wait for a hiker to stumble upon mortal remains. Wait for some new information to emerge. Wait for a miracle. Dorothy Brennan refused to hold a memorial service. "He is not dead," she would insist. "Not until I see evidence. Not until I know." She kept the empty glass case in the living room, waiting for the day when Tom would come home and put his rifle back in place. She kept his clothes in his closet. She kept his place at the dinner table. She made black coffee every morning, the way he liked it, just in case. Michael took over his father's job at the sawmill. At 17 years old, he became the family provider. Sarah stopped talking about her dreams of becoming a teacher. Bobby stopped asking to go hunting. Tom's blue pickup remained parked in the Oak Street driveway, slowly covered by rust and fallen leaves, a silent monument to the man who had disappeared. And in the mountains, the pine trees swayed in the wind, guarding their secrets. The years that followed were difficult for the Brennan family and for the town of Elk Ridge. Tom's disappearance had torn a hole in the fabric of the community, and that hole never really healed. 1958 came and went. Then 1959, 1960, 1961. Each spring, when the snow melted, hunters and hikers would be in the mountains, and there was always the silent hope that perhaps this would be the year when something would be found. But each autumn arrived without answers. Dorothy aged in ways that went beyond the mere passing of time. Her hair turned completely gray before her 40th birthday. Deep lines formed around her eyes and mouth. She developed a way of looking through people, as if she were always searching for someone who was not there. Michael married in 1959 to a local girl named Jennifer. They had a son in 1960, whom they named Thomas, in honor of the grandfather he would never know. Michael became supervisor of the sawmill in 1961, assuming the position his father had held. But friends said there was a sadness in him, a quietness that had never been there before. Sarah graduated from high school, but did not go to college as she had planned. Instead, she stayed in Elk Ridge, helping her mother, working at the local library. She never married. When asked about it years later, she would say, "How do you build a future when the past is never really resolved?" Bobby, who was only 8 years old when his father disappeared, grew up with fragmented memories of Tom. The feeling of a large, calloused hand holding his, the sound of a deep laugh, the smell of gun oil and pine. He would become a veterinarian, developing a passion for helping animals that some thought was his way of dealing with his inability to help his father. In town, people stopped talking openly about Tom around 1960. Not because they had forgotten him, but because there was nothing new to say. Every theory had been discussed to exhaustion. Every possible explanation had been considered and discarded. The disappearance of Thomas Brennan had become just another of the permanent mysteries of that region, like the others that came before it. But some people could not let go. James Parker, Tom's best friend, continued searching. Every weekend between 1958 and 1962, he climbed those mountains, scouring areas that had already been searched dozens of times, hoping to find something others had missed. His wife begged him to stop, worried that his obsession was consuming him. But he could not. "Tom would have done the same for me," he would say. "He never would have given up, so I cannot give up." Sheriff Mitchell retired in 1960, but not before making his successor, Sheriff John Dalton, promise that the Brennan case would remain open, that it would never be filed away or forgotten. Forest Ranger David Kowalski, who had been the last person to see Tom before Bobby Chen, left the job in 1959. Friends said he never forgave himself for letting Tom enter those mountains that morning, even though rationally there was nothing he could have done differently. Bobby Chen, the man who had the last confirmed conversation with Tom, moved from Pinewood in 1958. He would tell an interviewer years later, "I have relived that conversation 1,000 times. I tried to remember if there was something he said, something in his voice or manner that could have been a warning. But there was nothing. He was just Tom, going hunting, as he had done hundreds of times before." New and increasingly elaborate theories continued to emerge. In 1959, an article in a mystery magazine suggested that Tom had stumbled upon an illegal moonshine operation in the mountains and had been killed by bootleggers. But investigations found no evidence of any bootlegging activity in that area. In 1960, a self-published book by a ufologist claimed that Tom and others who had disappeared in the region had been abducted by extraterrestrials. The book pointed to reports of strange lights seen over the mountains, although none of them were reported in November of 1957. In 1961, a psychic from New York wrote to Sheriff Dalton, claiming to have visions of Tom alive, living under a new identity in California, having suffered amnesia. California police followed up on various leads, but all led to nothing. The truth, as inadequate as it was, remained unchanged. Thomas Brennan had entered the Appalachian Mountains on a clear November morning and had completely disappeared, as if he had never existed. And then, on October 19, 1962, almost exactly 5 years after Tom disappeared, 2 boys found something that would transform the mystery from something inexplicable into something completely impossible. It was a Friday afternoon, the weather clear and mild with temperatures around 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect autumn conditions. 2 boys from Elk Ridge, Danny Patterson, 12 years old, and his younger brother Mark, 10 years old, had left classes early and decided to explore an area of the mountains where they used to camp with their father. This area was approximately 5 miles south of the Wolf Valley Plateau, Tom's intended location. It was reached by a completely different trail, Miller's Gap Trail, which branched off from the main road in a totally different direction from the Black Creek Trail that Tom had taken. The boys were looking for mushrooms, an activity their father had taught them. It was around 3 in the afternoon when Mark, the younger one, tripped over an exposed root and fell among a pile of leaves at the foot of a large oak tree. "I was upset because I hurt myself," Mark would recall years later. "But then my hand touched something cold and hard under the leaves. Something metallic." Mark began, digging through the leaves, and his brother Danny joined him. In moments, they had unearthed something that made both of them completely still. It was a rifle, specifically a Winchester Model 70, with walnut stock and telescopic sight. And on the metal plate on the stock, engraved in the metal, were the initials, TMB Thomas Michael Brennan. Danny, the older one, immediately understood what they had found. "We need to go home," he told his brother. "We need to go home now." The boys ran back down the trail, leaving the rifle where it was, knowing instinctively that they should not touch it again. They arrived home at 3:45, almost breathless, and told their parents what they had found. At 4:10 in the afternoon, Sheriff Dalton received a call. At 4:30, he was at the location with 3 deputies and James Parker, who insisted on coming along. As James knelt beside that oak tree, brushing the leaves off Tom's rifle, tears ran down his face. "It is his," he whispered. "Jesus Christ, it really is his." The rifle was carefully documented, photographed, and then removed for analysis. What investigators discovered in the hours and days that followed only deepened the mystery. The rifle was in surprisingly good condition considering it had been exposed to the elements for nearly 5 years. There was significant rust on the metal stock and internal components, but the wood was relatively preserved, protected largely by the dense layer of leaves that had accumulated over it through the years. The rifle was unloaded. There was no cartridge in the chamber, no bullet in the magazine. Experts from West Virginia University examined the rifle, but after 5 years of exposure to rain, snow, humidity, and extreme temperature variations, any delicate forensic evidence had been completely degraded. There were no recoverable fingerprints. There were no visible bloodstains, although after so much time and so much weathering, even if there had been blood, originally it would have been washed away long ago. There were no obvious signs of physical damage to the rifle that would indicate struggle or violence, but there was also no way to be certain what might have been erased by time. What investigators could determine, based on circumstantial evidence, was that the rifle appeared to have been at that location for an extended period. The layer of leaves over it was substantial, representing possibly 3 or 4 fall seasons, perhaps more. The rust pattern suggested consistent exposure to the elements over years, not months. The way the rifle was positioned, horizontal under the tree, did not seem to be the result of having been simply dropped or thrown. But that was only an impression, not a definitive conclusion. But here was the part that made the mystery even deeper. There was no way to be absolutely certain of exactly when the rifle had been placed there. It could have been shortly after Tom's disappearance in 1957. It could have been months later. It could, theoretically, have been even years later, although the pattern of leaf accumulation made that less likely. The frustrating truth was that after 5 years of torrential rains, heavy snowfalls, freezing and thawing, vegetation growth and animal activity, the surrounding soil had been disturbed and recomposed so many times that it was impossible to determine with certainty when the rifle had arrived there. The location was equally puzzling. The rifle was found approximately 5 miles south of the Wolf Valley Plateau, Tom's stated destination. To reach that specific location under that oak tree, Tom would have had to deviate dramatically from his planned route. He would have had to descend from the Black Creek Trail, crossed rough mountainous terrain, including 2 steep ravines and a stream, and then climbed up through the Miller's Gap Trail area. Why would he do that? No one knew. Perhaps he was chasing a wounded deer and the chase led him in that direction. Experienced hunters will pursue a wounded animal for great distances to prevent unnecessary suffering. But if that were the case, why would he carefully unload his rifle and place it under a tree? Why not simply drop it if he were in danger or disoriented? A new search was immediately launched, now focused on the area around the oak tree. More than 100 volunteers scoured every square meter within a 2-mile radius. They searched for mortal remains, clothing, Tom's backpack, his thermos, his compass, anything. Nothing was found. Tracking dogs were brought again, but after 5 years, there was no scent trail to follow. Any olfactory evidence had been completely erased by time, by the seasons, by the hundreds of other animal and human scents that had passed through the area since then. The dogs walked in circles, but could not pick up anything conclusive. The search continued for 2 weeks, and then another. But it was like searching for a ghost. There was nothing more to find beyond that solitary rifle under that oak tree. The discovery triggered a new wave of media interest. Journalists from as far away as New York descended upon Elk Ridge. The headline in the Charleston Gazette read, "Missing Hunter's Rifle Found After 5 Years. No Trace of Man." Radio programs discussed the case. Mystery magazines published elaborate theories. The disappearance of Thomas Brennan which had begun to fade from public consciousness, was suddenly on everyone's lips again. Dorothy Brennan was informed about the discovery by James Parker, who drove to her house on the afternoon of October 19th. She listened in silence as he explained what the Patterson boys had found. When he finished, she simply nodded. "Can I see it?" she asked. The rifle was in evidence, but Sheriff Dalton made an exception. 2 days later, Dorothy stood in the evidence room of the sheriff's office, staring at her husband's rifle through the plastic bag in which it was stored. She ran her fingers over the plastic where Tom's initials were engraved. "He would never leave this behind," she whispered. "Not voluntarily. Not unless something was terribly wrong, or unless he had no choice." Michael, now 22 years old, stood beside her. "What do you think happened, Mom?" he asked. Dorothy was silent for a long time. Then she said something that would haunt everyone who heard it. "I think your father found something in those mountains. Or something found him. And I think we will never know what it was." The FBI was contacted again in November of 1962. Agents briefly reviewed the case, examined the rifle, but their conclusions did not change. There was no evidence of federal crime. There were no concrete leads to follow. The case would remain with local authorities. Sheriff Dalton issued a statement in December of 1962. "The discovery of Mr. Brennan's rifle, while significant, has not brought us closer to understanding what happened to him. After 5 years, physical evidence has been degraded beyond the point of conclusive analysis. The case remains open, and we will continue to investigate any new information that arises. But I must be honest with the community. Without mortal remains, without additional witnesses, without preserved forensic evidence, it is unlikely that we will ever know with certainty what happened to Thomas Brennan on that November day in 1957. It was a bitter but honest admission. The mystery would remain a mystery. More than 68 years have passed since Thomas Brennan disappeared on that November morning in 1957. More than 63 years since his rifle was found under that oak tree in 1962. And there are still no definitive answers. What do we know for certain? We know that Tom Brennan entered those mountains, alive and well, at 6:17 in the morning on November 16, 1957. We know that Bobby Chen spoke with him at 7:23, 2.5 miles into the trail. We know that Tom was heading to the Wolf Valley Plateau. And we know that he never got there, or if he did, he left no trace. We know that at some point, his rifle ended up 5 miles from his intended route, unloaded and placed under an oak tree, where it remained for approximately 5 years before being discovered. But we do not know when it was placed there, by whom, or under what circumstances. And we know that Thomas Brennan was never seen or heard from again. But what really happened? 68 years later, there are still only theories, only speculation, only questions without answers. The most mundane explanation, the one many investigators eventually adopted, is that Tom suffered some kind of sudden medical emergency, a stroke or heart attack that left him confused and disoriented. In this state, he wandered off his planned route, eventually reaching the oak tree area. Perhaps, in a final moment of clarity, he unloaded his rifle to make it safe, placed it where it could be found, and then continued wandering until he collapsed somewhere where his body was never discovered. There is a phenomenon known in search and rescue circles called terminal burrowing behavior, where people dying from hypothermia or other medical conditions crawl into tight, hidden spaces, almost as if trying to hibernate. If Tom did this in his confused state, he could be under a fallen log, in a small crevice between rocks, in an unmapped cave, somewhere where he would never be found. This theory has the merit of being possible, but it has problems. Tom was in excellent health. He was 42 years old, fit and strong. No known history of heart problems. He was appropriately dressed for the weather. It was mid-morning, not the middle of the night, and hypothermia would be unlikely in a well-dressed person in motion. The second main theory is animal predation, but that has even more problems. There were no known active bears in that area that November. There were no large predators capable of taking down and completely disappearing an armed adult man. And even if there were, there would be signs. Blood on the trees, on the ground, torn clothing, drag marks, something. The idea that an animal could make a man completely disappear, along with all his possessions except his rifle, without leaving any trace, is practically impossible. The third theory is human violence. Perhaps Tom stumbled upon something he should not have seen. An illegal moonshine operation, bootleggers, someone hiding something in the mountains, and perhaps that person or persons decided that Tom had to be silenced. But again, where is the evidence? Tom was armed. He was a war veteran. He would not be easily overpowered without a fight, and a fight would have left signs. And if someone killed him, how did they hide the body so completely that it was never found, despite massive searches? Why would they have kept his rifle and then placed it under a tree 5 years later, or at any time? It does not make logical sense. And then there are the theories that defy conventional explanation. The Appalachian area has a long and documented history of inexplicable disappearances. David Paulides, a former police officer who has spent decades investigating disappearances in national parks and wilderness areas, has documented hundreds of cases that share disturbingly similar characteristics to Tom's. Experienced outdoor people disappearing in good weather conditions. No trail found despite extensive and rapid searches. Tracking dogs inexplicably losing the trail. And when personal items are finally discovered, they are in locations that have already been searched multiple times, or in locations that do not make sense given the person's known direction of travel. Paulides does not offer definitive explanations in his work. He simply documents the patterns and asks questions. But the patterns are impossible to ignore. Disappearances frequently occur near large rock formations or bodies of water. They frequently involve people who were following or tracking animals. They frequently occur in areas with histories of other similar disappearances. All these factors apply to Tom Brennan's case. He was near rock formations, he was tracking deer, and the area had a long history of inexplicable disappearances. Some researchers point to possible geological phenomena. The Appalachians are some of the oldest mountains on Earth, formed approximately 480 million years ago. They are geologically complex, full of unmapped caves, vertical shafts, underground formations that have never been fully explored or catalogued. Could there be something in that specific geology that creates dangerous conditions for humans? Pockets of natural gas that could cause sudden loss of consciousness? Unusual magnetic fields that interfere with navigation and orientation? Geological instabilities that create sudden openings in the ground that later close? There is no solid scientific evidence for any of these ideas, but there is also not much scientific study focused specifically on this question. And then there are the explanations that completely defy conventional science and that most people immediately dismiss. Dimensional portals, temporal displacements, extraterrestrial intervention, paranormal phenomena. These ideas are easily ridiculed, and there is certainly no scientific evidence to support them. But for those who have spent time deeply studying the patterns of missing persons in American wilderness areas, the cases become difficult to explain with purely conventional theories. I do not pretend to have answers, James Parker would say in an interview in 1985, 3 years before his death from cancer. He had been searching for Tom for almost 30 years at that point. I searched for Tom for decades. I read everything I could find about his disappearance and similar cases, and what I learned is that there are things in this world that we do not understand. These mountains, they are ancient, older than our civilization, older than our categories of thought. Perhaps there are things that happen here that our science simply cannot explain yet, or perhaps never can. I am not saying I believe in ghosts or aliens or any other specific thing. I am just saying that after everything I have seen, everything I searched for, I can no longer pretend that I am certain of what is possible and what is not. Dorothy Brennan never officially accepted that her husband was dead. She never held a memorial service. She lived until 1989, dying of heart failure at 72 years old. Until her last day, she kept the glass case in the living room with Tom's rifle inside, returned to the family in 1975 after 13 years in evidence. She kept his place at the après-coup table. She kept his clothes in the closet. She waited. On her deathbed, with her 3 children around her, Dorothy's last words were, "Tell your father I waited. Tell him I always waited." Michael Brennan retired from the Appalachian timber sawmill in 1999 after 42 years in the same job his father had. He would give a final interview to the local newspaper in 2010, at 70 years old, a few months before his death from emphysema complications. "I was a boy when my father disappeared," he said in that interview. "I was 17 years old. I thought that when I grew up, when I became a man, when I gained life experience, I would finally understand what happened. But now I am 70 years old. I am a grandfather, and I understand less than ever. My father's absence defined my entire life. The unanswered question, the unresolved mystery. You learn to live with it, but you never really accept it. Every birthday, every Christmas, every important moment of my life, there was that empty space where he should have been. And the worst part is not knowing. If he had died in a car accident, it would be devastating. But there would be closure. There would be a grave to visit. There would be answers. But this never ends. The not knowing never ends." Sarah Brennan is still alive in 2025, at 82 years old, living in an assisted living home in Charleston. Her mind remains sharp, although her body has weakened with age. When a reporter visited her in 2023 for the 66th anniversary of her father's disappearance, she spoke for almost 2 hours about him. "People ask if I remember him," she said, her voice still clear despite the years. "I was 14 years old when he disappeared. Of course I remember him. I remember everything. I remember how he smelled, like pine and soap and that oil he used on the rifle. I remember how his voice sounded when he read to me before bed, even when I was already too old for bedtime stories. I remember how he laughed, that deep laugh that came from his chest. I remember the last time I saw him going out the door that morning. I was in the kitchen making toast. He waved at me, just a simple wave, and I waved back. And that was the end. 66 years later, and I still see that wave. I still wonder what would have happened if I had said something different, or asked to go with him, but there are no answers. There are never answers." Bobby Brennan, the youngest son who was only 8 years old when his father disappeared, became a vocal advocate for families of missing persons. He helped found a nonprofit organization in 1995 called Never Forgotten, which provides resources, emotional support, and practical assistance to families dealing with unresolved disappearances. My father taught me about compassion. Bobby, now 76 years old, said in an interview in 2024, "I can barely remember him, but the stories I heard, the way people talked about him, taught me who I wanted to be, and the pain my family went through, the way the community supported us during those terrible years, showed me the power of human compassion. I try to honor that. Every family we help, every missing person we try to find, is my way of honoring my father. Even though I can never bring him back, I can perhaps help another family find answers, to find closure, to not have to live with the not knowing for the rest of their lives." Tom's Winchester Model 70 rifle, with the initials TMB engraved on the stock, is now on permanent display at the Randolph County Historical Museum in Elk Ridge, installed in 2005 as part of an exhibition about the town's history. There is a plaque beside it that tells the story of Tom's disappearance. Tourists and local residents regularly stop to look at it, read the words, touch the glass of the display case. The plaque says, "This rifle belonged to Thomas Michael Brennan, 1915 to 1957, a respected member of the Elk Ridge community who disappeared in the Appalachian Mountains on November 16, 1957, while hunting. Despite extensive searches involving more than 200 people, no trace of Mr. Brennan was found until October 19, 1962, when this rifle was discovered under an oak tree, approximately 5 miles from his planned route. The circumstances of his disappearance remain a mystery to this day. Mr. Brennan left behind a wife, Dorothy, and 3 children, Michael, Sarah, and Robert. He is remembered as a man of integrity, compassion, and courage. The Black Creek Trail still exists and is still popular among hikers and hunters. The Wolf Valley Plateau, Tom's intended destination, is now a favorite spot for birdwatchers and nature photographers. Most people who walk these trails do not know the story of Thomas Brennan, but some do, and those who know frequently report feeling something strange in those areas. A quietness that seems deeper than it should. A sensation of being watched. A weight in the air. Are they just imaginations influenced by knowing the story? Probably. But those who feel it swear it is real. The oak tree under which the rifle was found is still standing on Miller's Gap Trail. In 2007, on the 50th anniversary of Tom's disappearance, the Brennan family and community members placed a small bronze plaque at the base of the tree. It simply says, "In memory of Thomas M. Brennan, November 16, 1957. Never forgotten, we still wait for answers." The tree has become a site of silent pilgrimage. People leave flowers there. Small stones stacked in improvised memorials. Notes written to a man who disappeared before many of them were born. The Randolph County Sheriff's Office still maintains the case as officially open. It is the oldest unsolved case in their files. Every few years, a new lead emerges. Someone claims to have found bones in the mountains, but analysis shows they are from animals. Someone claims to remember seeing something suspicious on that November day in 1957, but memories prove to be unreliable or impossible to verify. Hunters occasionally report finding old items in the mountains, a rusted compass, fragments of fabric, but none of them can be definitively linked to Tom. The case periodically appears in true crime podcasts, television programs about unsolved mysteries, internet forums dedicated to inexplicable disappearances. Each new generation discovers it, debates the theories, offers new perspectives, but no one gets closer to the truth than people were in 1957. In 2017, on the 60th anniversary of Tom's disappearance, the History Channel produced an hour-long documentary about the case entitled Vanished in the Appalachians, the Thomas Brennan Mystery. The program interviewed Sarah and Bobby Brennan, retraced Tom's route, brought in experts in search and rescue, geologists, and mystery investigators. They did not reach definitive conclusions. How could they? After 60 years, there was no new evidence to examine. Just the same questions, the same theories, the same impenetrable mystery. But what the documentary did was reignite public interest. Thousands of people visited Elk Ridge in the following months. They walked the trails. They stood at the Wolf Valley Plateau. They touched the oak tree where the rifle was found. They tried to understand. They tried to feel some connection to what happened there. It is strange, the current sheriff, Margaret Chen, granddaughter of Bobby Chen, who had the last conversation with Tom, told the documentary how this case continues to resonate with people. I think it is because it touches on fundamental fears. The fear that we can simply disappear, that we can leave behind people we love without explanation, without closure. And it also touches on our fascination with mystery. We want to believe there is an answer to everything, a logical explanation. But cases like Tom Brennan's force us to confront the possibility that perhaps there is not. Perhaps some things simply remain unknown. So, what really happened to Thomas Brennan on that November morning in 1957? The honest and frustrating truth is that we will probably never know. After 68 years, any physical evidence that could have provided definitive answers has long since decomposed and disappeared. All direct witnesses have aged or died. The terrain has changed. The mountains have guarded their secrets too well for too long. But we can look at the facts we have and make our own assessments. We know that Tom Brennan was an experienced, careful, and competent man. He was not someone who would get lost easily or take unnecessary risks. His route was planned. His equipment was prepared. He had made that hike dozens of times before. We know that the weather was good when he left, although a storm was approaching. We know that he was in good spirits, excited, with no signs of distress or intention to disappear. We know that he was last seen at 7:23 in the morning, moving with purpose and confidence toward his destination. And we know that he never got there, or at least never left any trace of having gotten there. We know that his rifle was found 5 years later, 5 miles, from his intended course, unloaded and placed under a tree. But we do not know when it was placed there, by whom, or under what circumstances. After 5 years of exposure to the elements, the evidence was too degraded to tell the story. And we know that despite massive searches, despite hundreds of volunteers, despite tracking dogs and helicopters and professional investigators, no other trace of Thomas Brennan was found. No bones, no clothing, no backpack, no compass, nothing but that solitary rifle. So, what does that tell us? If we go with the simplest explanation, Occam's razor, we would say that Tom suffered a sudden medical emergency, perhaps a stroke or heart attack, although he had no known history of heart problems. This left him confused. He wandered off course, eventually reaching the oak tree area. At some point, he had enough presence of mind to unload his rifle and place it where it could be found. Then he continued wandering until he collapsed somewhere remote, an unmapped cave, a deep crevice between rocks, somewhere where his body would never be discovered. This explanation has the advantage of being possible within the known laws of physics and biology. It does not require anything supernatural or extraordinary. And there are certainly precedents for people dying in the mountains and never being found, especially in terrain as rugged and densely forested as the Appalachians. But there are problems with this explanation. Tom was in excellent health. He was well-dressed and equipped. It was mid-morning on a clear day. Even in a confused state, why would he walk 5 miles in such a specific direction? And why was only the rifle found? Where were all his other possessions? So perhaps the answer is more sinister. Perhaps Tom encountered something or someone in the mountains that he should not have encountered. Perhaps he was a victim of violence. Perhaps someone hid his body so well that it was never discovered, and kept the rifle as a trophy or evidence, only to discard it years later. But this explanation also has serious problems. Tom was armed and trained. There would be signs of struggle. And why would a killer keep the rifle for years, only to discard it later in a way that could be found? It does not make logical sense. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the answer is something our current science cannot fully explain. Something about those ancient mountains, those 480-million-year-old geological formations, that history of disappearances stretching back centuries. Perhaps there are natural phenomena we do not yet understand. Geomagnetic anomalies, gas pockets, geological instabilities, or perhaps something even stranger, something that defies our current categories of thought. I am not saying I believe in ghosts, or aliens, or dimensional portals, but I am saying there are things in this world we do not yet understand. And the case of Thomas Brennan, with all its impossible and contradictory elements, seems to suggest that perhaps we are dealing with one of those things. Whatever happened on that November day in 1957, in the depths of the Appalachian Mountains, remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of American history. A reminder that even in our modern world, with all our technology and science, there are still places where people can simply disappear. There are still unanswered questions. There are still mysteries that defy explanation. Thomas Michael Brennan walked into those mountains 68 years ago. He never walked back out. And the mountains, ancient and silent, continue to guard the secret of what happened to him. If you ever find yourself walking the Black Creek Trail, or standing at the Wolf Valley Plateau, or touching that oak tree where his rifle was found, stop for a moment. Listen to the silence. Feel the weight of those ancient mountains. And think of Tom Brennan, a good man who loved his family, knew those mountains better than most, and who simply vanished into the air as if he had never existed. And if you hear something strange in that silence, if you feel something inexplicable in that air, well, perhaps you are touching the same mystery that touched Tom Brennan. Perhaps you are feeling whatever it is that makes those mountains so beautiful and so dangerous, so inviting and so merciless. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient. They were here long before us, and will be here long after we are gone. They have seen civilizations rise and fall. They guard countless secrets in their valleys and peaks, in their caves and ravines. And one of those secrets is what happened to Thomas Brennan. A secret that, after 68 years, they have shown no sign of revealing. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We have dozens of other unsolved mystery cases that will make you question everything you think you know about the world. And leave in the comments what you think happened to Tom Brennan. Medical emergency, violence, or something more inexplicable? I read all comments and love hearing your theories. Until the next mystery.